We're here in the new workshop for Reflect Orbital with co-founders Ben Nowak and Tristan Semmelhack, which is pretty cool because we filmed the original episode in your guys' old facility, and now we're here in this new one that's how much bigger, roughly? And
it's 5x, I think.
5x bigger, which is just like a matter of weeks in the time that's happened. You guys move fast. So if you haven't seen the main episode, you should watch it. But for context for people who haven't yet and should go see it, can you give a quick kind of description of what you guys are doing at Reflect?
Yeah, so sunlight is the only reason solar farms exist, and they basically do nothing at night. So we were trying to find a way to solve that. We're basically building a reliable system to control sunlight after sunset and before sunrise, and that'll allow those solar farms that already exist and have already been built to make even more money, and it makes it a lot easier to make 24/7 renewable electricity, which is something that the whole world is kind of trying to get to. So it's not like we're a direct replacement for anything, but we do make it a lot easier to get there. And if you have a good solution that's pretty cheap, there's a good spot for it on the grid. It's been a thing since the 1920s.
Yeah.
It's been in science fiction books for a very long time. NASA's written a bunch of papers about it, like a really big one in 1978 where they're like, oh yeah, it's going to cost $500 billion. And then the Russians picked it up in the 1990s. They actually launched 2 satellites to space. The first one worked, the second one didn't, in 1992. And they actually did the reflection. They reflected sunlight down onto the ground. They're using it to warm up mines. There weren't really solar farms around back then. Solar was still super expensive. And also it was really expensive to get to space. And it turns out since the Russians did this thing, space flight has gone down by 97x. And we've built 2,000x more solar farms around the world. And now solar is also the cheapest way to produce electricity during the day. So yeah, the macroeconomic environment has changed a lot. So it's definitely a very old idea that people have kind of dreamed about for a long time. But it's just getting to the point where the world's kind of ready for this. And we've already built a lot of the groundwork.
Why do you think that this has never really been tried before, commercially, outside of the Russians doing it back in the day?
I think, it's actually been tried a lot. People tried it a lot in 2007. There's a few companies that have looked into it pretty heavily. They've looked into reflectors, but usually what people look into is putting solar panels in space and then beaming the electricity to the ground and trying to do it that way. And when you do that, it you can make it work, but it's pretty expensive and pretty difficult. So it's always 10 years away, 20 years away, that kind of thing. Doing a simple solution with just reflectors hasn't been looked at too deeply. And there's a few things that we're doing that really make it work a lot better. When you break down the economics to the basics, it turns out to be pretty simple.
I find it's interesting, even before you guys came on the scene, there was this sort of people, a lot of very smart people were like, oh, space-based reflective solar makes no sense, it doesn't add up. And then you guys released this amazing demo video a while back, and a lot of the people that I saw tweeting those same things totally changed their mind once they saw your demo. So that was hilarious.
Yeah.
But aside from that, so a lot of people have tried it. Why specifically are you guys trying it at this point?
We really like our approach. It's the development that we're doing is really derived from a first principles simplicity-based perspective, which I think is pretty new. We really asked ourselves not just can we make energy from space, but a more broad question, which was if we had to make an energy system for humanity from scratch, what would that actually look like? And we are basing the entire system off of 3 elements that we think are very, very fundamental. It took us a while to boil it down to just what are the core fundamental pieces. And the biggest one is sunlight. Sunlight is just this unbelievably abundant resource that fills most of near-Earth space. If you think about near-Earth space as a void to fill, it's filled with a huge amount of this pretty energy-dense resource. So that's one of the key pillars that we wanted to base the entire system on when we thought about an energy source for humanity. And then mirrors themselves are a great way to move the location of sunlight. So mirrors basically have no moving parts. They're just a reflective surface in and of themselves. So that's this other very key basic piece of the puzzle. And then the third piece of the puzzle, solar panels, which are these static, mass-manufactured, super simple ways to turn sunlight into the energy source that we use the most, which is electricity. So we wanted to start with this foundation of 3 very simple core elements. And that's I think the way we picture this is why we think we're going to be very different. We're not just trying to get energy down from space. We're trying to make a fundamentally new energy system based off of first principles. We've also just spent a lot of time, too, iterating and just chopping the concept up to the bare minimum it has to be so that it's something that's, from an implementation perspective, very simple, but also something that can leverage the low costs of mass manufacturing. So instead of very large space structures, we have lots of smaller vehicles that are mass manufactured. So we can take advantage of costs at scale like that. That's a pretty novel approach. The way that we concentrate sunlight by using several mirrors in parallel as opposed to just one giant reflector hasn't really been tried before.
So is the idea with the concentration of multiple mirrors that it intensifies sort of the beam of light, or what's the general idea there versus like you need a one-to-one size mirror for the ground or the space that you're wanting to fill in the ground? What's the gist idea there?
I mean, you don't want a gigantic mirror because that'll increase the size of the spot, that'll increase the complexity of the satellite itself, and also it's not the ideal optic for this. So we can approximate a very large parabola that's designed to have the correct focal length for the relative distance between the satellite and the target on the ground. And we approximate that giant parabola with a much smaller mirrors. So instead of having some super humongous parabolic structure, we can break that up into something that's mass manufacturable and a lot simpler.
I love the concept, and I think like it's so simple once you hear it too. It's like we have these massive solar farms. Half of the time, they don't work. What if they could work the other half of the time? Is like just a huge. You can imagine how big of an opportunity it is. Despite that, a lot of people still, not even with Reflect, but just in history of space-based solar, are like, oh, there's so many problems with it. It'll never work. Just like they say about every other thing that ends up working eventually. I'm curious what you guys think are some of the most common sort of concerns or things that people think won't work about this idea when talking to people about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is it has to be cheaper than everything else. Otherwise, nobody's going to use it. You fundamentally are competing to produce electricity with every other thing that can produce electricity. So yeah, you have to be cheaper than that. The way we approach this is immediately just diving into the math. That's kind of the first thing you do is like build out a spreadsheet, do the initial sizing calcs. The actual calc is pretty simple. It's like, how much can we build a satellite for? How big of a mirror does that get us? You add that to how much it costs to get to space. So then like the mass of the thing comes into play there, and what rocket you're riding on comes into play there. Obviously that's getting a lot better with time. And then you kind of divide those costs by how much it can produce. How much it can produce is driven a lot by how many solar farms are around the world and how often you can actually fly over them and deliver them sunlight. That's a huge factor. The other piece of it is how much you're actually able to sell the electricity for. Electricity that's produced after sunset and before sunrise is a little bit more valuable than electricity that's produced right at noon. Electricity that's produced right at noon is competing directly with solar photovoltaic during the day. And that's ridiculously hard because PV solar during the day is the cheapest form of electricity. So if you can compete at a different time, then it's much better. And this is usually what batteries come in to solve. They'll charge up during the day when prices are really low, and then they'll sell it at night when it's really cheap. If we can actually just sell directly at night, or they'll sell at night when it's really expensive. If we can actually just sell directly at night when it's really expensive, then the system makes a bit more money. So you're able to offset those costs a lot better. And it really comes into like this pretty simple equation. It gets hard when you calculate like the cost of capital and how that gets broken out over time. But if the thing returns on the investment very quickly, it's a lot easier to justify it. So yeah, the big thing with us is we can break even faster than solar, which is quite good. So like that kind of gets over the economic thing. And like when you're able to break even very quickly, you have a much better job of raising capital for something. This is one of the problems that nuclear energy has. Like, it takes like 17 to 22 years to actually build a nuclear power plant. So you have to take out like gigantic loans, and it takes a very long time for them to pay off. So you're just kind of paying interest on this loan for a really long time. You don't want to be doing that. So you want to make sure that like the thing is cheap enough and it makes enough money fast enough that it can pay itself off quickly enough that you don't have expensive interest payments on the infrastructure. It also makes it a lot easier, to raise money for something and invest in it because you're going to see that money come in a lot quicker. That way you can like scale a lot faster. This is kind of like the CAGR, or like the annual growth rate of the idea, or like how fast you can use the money from like one profitable thing to invest in another thing. So like, yeah, getting the really low ROI, and that's really good. And yeah, it basically comes down to like, people are like, oh wow, you're making so many crazy bets on this. Like, how do you actually know that you're going to be able to do that? And I think like fundamentally, it's pretty simple. There's like, the satellite design, how big it is, how much it costs to make that thing, how to get it to space. Like there's the economics of it today, but then there's also, okay, what are those economics going to do in the future? Like we have to compete with energy technologies like 10, 20, 30 years in the future. And we have to be like cheaper than everything that long into the future. And how do you know that that's going to happen? Well, the first thing is solar is growing faster than any other energy technology. Like more money is invested in new solar projects than any other energy technology. That seems like a pretty solid bet. Like we're going to bet on that getting bigger. Okay, yeah, it's definitely getting bigger. That's definitely going to continue. The other thing is spaceflight getting cheaper. Like spaceflight, will it get cheaper in the future? I think absolutely, especially when companies like us come along and actually have a use for the gigantic rockets that like SpaceX and other companies want to build. There's going to be a reason to build even bigger rockets, and they're going to get even cheaper. And that whole economy is going to just take off. So those are kind of the two primary bets. I guess the only other bet is that people will need energy in the future. I think that's like one of the safest bets ever. Like people have always needed energy. We're always going to need more energy. If you can give people cheaper access to more energy, they will always find a better way to use it. And we'll just like invent new ways to waste electricity because it won't matter because it'll be so cheap and free. I think that's like, I don't know, the ultimate like bullish take on the future.
I think a lot of times too, people wonder like, how could this be cheaper than batteries as well? And I'm curious what your sort of mental calculus on that was before founding and the company and like projecting that in the future, why you still think the idea makes sense and is viable.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to directly be cheaper than batteries. And I think like people get that wrong when we're like, oh, we have to be cheaper than batteries and like cheaper than nuclear. And we defend that pretty hard because like the economics do work and we can be cheaper than those technologies. But I think it's really important to say like, there is definitely a place in the future for batteries and nuclear technologies. Like we're not like the only solution. We make sense at a certain time, and then batteries make sense a little bit later. Like there's a certain percent of everything that you're going to have on the grid. Like our percent is not going to be zero. It's going to be a bit higher than zero. And the cheaper we can get, the higher that's going to be. But it's never going to be 100%. There's no 100% solution to our energy needs because we just need so much energy. And it's also one of those regional things. Like, you know, certain technologies make sense in certain regions. Like nuclear energy makes a lot of sense for France, and they wanted to be completely powered by nuclear energy. But Germany is like, no, we don't really want nuclear energy. And obviously, like, there's a lot of politics involved in that, and you know that carries over everywhere. But there are just like different regions that have different ideas. There's different amounts of energy available in different places. Like there's a lot of sunlight available in the Sahara Desert, and there's barely any available in Norway. And we can come in and help like solve a lot of those issues and figure things out. But it's still one of those things where like you're going to need to throw everything at the table, and yeah, have to figure out what makes sense in different regions. So like we can be cheaper than batteries and we can be cheaper than nuclear, but we're not going to fully replace them. Batteries definitely have a place on the grid. They serve a very good purpose. Like you're always going to have power that's cheap at some times and more expensive at other times, and you're going to want to charge up batteries at that one time and sell it at that other time. Or you're going to want to install some crypto mining server to make use of the cheap energy and then make money with it that way. We just kind of come in as this other technology that smooths out the curve a little bit. So like, you have all these solar farms that are out there. They can make a little bit more money. They could be a little bit more economical. There's a lot of people that want to be like 24/7 renewable. Like you have these big data centers that are running these huge AI machines. Like, they want to run on more clean energy. Nuclear is pretty hard and takes a really long time. So like we can come in and kind of quickly solve that and get on it pretty quickly. And like, I mean, hopefully our solution is good enough and cheap enough that you don't really need anything else after that. Like I spent a really long time doing calculations on like how to store electricity or like how to capture lightning. Like that's kind of where it starts, right? You're like, oh, how do we capture lightning and actually like store it in something? It's like, it's really fast. It's really hard to do that. Then it's like, okay, well, what if we store it in like water that we could pump up to some high place and then like pump it through something and bring it low? And like people do this at scale, but it's really hard to find places that you can store that much water. Like you kind of end up ruining the local environment.
Also, water's just not dense enough, unfortunately.
Yeah, everybody can't have their own like little water tower.
Like, you kind of want like liquid lead for this kind of thing, but
yeah, that also is pretty expensive. Yeah, the material's just expensive. And then it was like, okay, what if I like mined a mountain and like moved all the energy down to a lower spot? And like, yeah, that's pretty hard. And then you could like bring it back up, but then it's like, okay, actually lifting that's pretty difficult. And there are companies working on that. But it's actually like really hard to store energy. And batteries do a surprisingly good job at it. But it's something that ideally you don't have to do. Like it works, but ideally you could just produce energy instead of needing to store it. And that's kind of what I think this idea is like fundamental strength. This is we don't have to store energy. We can fundamentally produce it. We can make new energy with no need to store it, or at least a lot less need to store it. And that just like, that can reduce the whole cost of everything. Like the sun is producing all this energy. We can get even more of it by controlling it better. We don't really need to store it for the times when the earth is pointed the wrong way.
Another interesting thing I think about too is like oftentimes people online who haven't really looked at a problem very deeply often think it's like all or nothing.
Yeah.
For example, like I worked at Astronomers for 2 years and people were like, oh, well, that makes no sense that Astronomers should exist when Starlink exists. It's like, Starlink is not an all or nothing business. Like very few businesses are all or nothing. And like, especially in energy, because it's not just, is there energy? It's, is there energy in the quantity I want it, where I want it, when I want it? And like one thing I love about Reflect is the ability to just move it where you need it. Versus like you mentioned, like in the main episode that it's like, people are looking at $40 billion to just funnel solar farm energy, like, I don't know exactly how far it was away, but farther away, when it's like you can just simply build a new, cheaper farm there and then point light there as needed more directly. It sounds like, though, that the most important thing is how cheaply can you make the satellites at scale? And I'm curious, Tristan, like how you guys, what are some of the for noobs, like what are some of the expensive parts of making these kinds of satellites? Like what are the things that you sort of focus on driving the cost down on?
Totally. I think the most expensive part of the satellite right now is how we're actuating the entire thing. One thing we love about our design right now is most of the value of the satellite comes from a static structure. It's a mirror. There's no incredibly fancy phased array or very high power electronics. Like, we're avoiding a lot of that complexity. The value is in this flat mirror. I think the most expensive part is probably going to be that mirror itself and how we actuate it. So I can't talk that much about it, but we have some really, really in-depth designs. The mirror itself, we think, is probably going to be the most expensive part of it, but it's going to be super light. It's really not going to be that complicated. We're already designing it right now to be manufactured at scale. That's something that we have to incorporate very early in. It's like, we're defining a lot of the architecture right now, and in each piece of the architecture, we're very concerned about how it performs at scale and what the costs are going to be at scale. We're also really trying to understand exactly what makes specific parts of satellites very expensive. There's no magic in making things cheap. Oftentimes, it's a lot of cutting corners. But the reality is the masters of cutting corners are the ones who end up making the cheap thing that's super revolutionary. So we have a lot of really interesting thoughts on exactly where to cut corners that makes things very cheap. And I think we're in a really unique development space because no one's had to manufacture satellites we have, maybe aside from Starlink. So there's so many new things to try where you can try to for reliability, for low cost. And I think another piece that we're going to really be able to leverage is the fact that launching so many vehicles means you just learn so much. Like, there's so much iteration in launching so many vehicles. Space itself is also just going to become a higher iteration place. So the ability for us to try things and learn just from reality is going to be significantly more possible. So yeah, I think that's kind of how we're thinking about cost right now.
Another kind of common concern you hear a lot is like, oh no, the sky is going to be light all the time. Can you explain why that is not going to be the case?
Yeah, totally. And this was something that we were very concerned about too. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't want to make something that's going to suck. Like, we don't want to make something that damages the world we like. Like, one of my favorite things is going to dark sky locations and looking at the stars and taking photos. That's like sacred area. So we were concerned about this for a bit. And what we realized is that we're very highly incentivized to be very specular. No one really wants to buy sunlight that doesn't hit them. So the economics of our business is like way better when we're very specular. Most satellites you see are super diffuse. So light that hits them basically goes everywhere, and that's where you can see them. And like, they can be very bright, like awe-inspiringly bright. But if you don't want that, it's pretty annoying. Almost all the light that's going to hit our satellites is going to go in one direction. That's kind of what specular means. And this is critical because, if you're not in the spot, you're not going to be able to see the light. If you're in the spot, you're going to see the light. And I actually think there's a chance it's super beautiful. If you want to go see it, you go to a spot and you'll just see this incredible halo of satellites moving above you. Like, I think a lot about signs that we're in the future. And I think if I walk around, like, this building is from like the 1950s. Like, cars are still cars, trains are still trains. But like, if you teleported to the future and you saw like a reflect sunlight spot and you're like, what's that? You'd definitely be like, we're in the future, something's changed.
Well, I think you can even see in the video too that you can't see it unless it's directly hitting you. Like, there's literally the moment where it's like it's like just a few feet off from hitting you on the ground looking down from the balloon test, and you can't see it. And then it flashes you and you're like, oh, now I can see it.
I think this is perhaps one of the like biggest intuitive learnings from that testing is it was really frustrating at first because our impression was like, okay, as we were aiming it, you'd see the mirror getting brighter, and it'd be really easy to tell, just like, oh, make it brighter. Yeah. It was so linear.
Not a speculative word.
It was nothing, then like, boom, flash, and gone, which makes sense according to physics.
Right.
But
it's still hard to grok.
Yeah. So like, but for the test, if I was like a little bit to the side, I couldn't see it. Like, I can move my head in and out of the spot. To just give an idea of how sharp that was. And so the mirror we tested with was a Mylar mirror. So it wasn't like a static bathroom mirror. It was thin film, it was tensioned. So
just that one right there.
Oh, yeah, you can see it.
Yeah, you can see it's really nice. There's also some holes in it when we moved it, but yeah. So, I think that gave us a lot of confidence that if we design the mirror correctly to be very specular, the light pollution problem shouldn't be as much of a problem as we think it is. I think there's another concern around scattering in the atmosphere. Like, if there's like a bunch of clouds or humidity in the atmosphere, you're going to end up with this glow that extends for hundreds of miles. The reality is if there's clouds, we're not going to be serving. Yeah. Because that's not going to be light hitting the ground. And also scattering itself as a property of our light transmission through the atmosphere is not a dominating factor. I think maybe at worst it increases the spot size a tiny bit. But there isn't a world where our spot is blown out in such a way that means like, tens of kilometers away you end up seeing it. It's very directed.
Right.
Yeah, and actually one thing to add to that is, like during hot air balloon testing, it was one mirror, but for the actual satellites, it's going to be hundreds of mirrors all working together to provide a lot of light to one spot. So it's going to be even less of a problem for that. Like it's going to be even more like tons here and less over here. Like it's not even like the Gaussian spot distribution. It's like tons of Gaussians all lined up. So it really makes that thing super nonlinear. And you have like this really steep drop off at the edges. Yeah, that's going to be pretty cool. And there's not going to be a beam that's coming down. That's another thing people ask is like, are there going to be just beams of light everywhere? Like the Luxor. It's like, no, like each beam is so much less bright than the Luxor, and they're all individually combining at the spot to like produce the electricity.
Yeah, like it's just normal sunlight. It's not like a laser. It's like you walk outside, it's that.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing. Yeah.
It's hot.
Keeping in mind that the spot's like 6 kilometers wide. Like it's not a beam. It's like a big spot.
Right.
And also like, what Ben said, like the concentration is real. Like the focal point is at the ground for a reason. We don't want it to be visible in space.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also like, there was actually a pilot flew through the beam while we were hot air balloon testing. He was just like one of those like light aircraft pilots.
Yeah.
It was pretty cool. He was like, oh yeah, I saw it, like thing was bright, it's cool.
That's awesome. and his plane did not crash.
His plane did not crash.
It's just sunlight.
Yeah, if you've actually experienced this problem, when you've been driving on the road and like somebody's rearview mirror like reflects into your eyes.
Yeah.
Actually,
Well, it's not even that bad
that.
because most of the time you're not staring at the sun. It just like that's like you're not like therefore you're not like looking up at the reflected satellites on purpose. Like they're just right. So I think you brought up Tristan how like balloon test or just testing period. You learn a lot of stuff that like is obvious once you see it, but it's not until you test it. For something as simple as like specularity, beam shine on you, you see beam, otherwise no beam. It's like very simple, but like you wouldn't know unless you try it. What other things or value did you get from the balloon test?
The balloon test itself was also just a great way to validate our fundamental physics. So we went into the tests with predictions and basic models of how we expect light to move as a function of what mirror we have up in the sky, how far it is, and what we have on the ground. So we knew what those parameters were going into the test, had our predictions, and then we can match our predictions to actual test data. So it was also just a great way to say, like, the physics behaves as expected. That's, it's kind of like a do your homework kind of step where you have to just make sure you're not missing something huge. And we were very close to our prediction, which was great. So I think that was another huge learning. I think it was also just it was a great way to play with aiming itself. So not necessarily like how it feels, but also like the challenges of aiming itself. You very quickly get a sense of, and this is kind of obvious in retrospect, but doing a bunch of sensor fusion to get the mirror aimed correctly means that it's really easy to just be off.
Yeah.
Way easier to have a simpler system where you can close the loop just based off of one single sensor itself. So we did a lot of interesting prototyping there that it may or may not inform future design, but it was a good sense of like, oh wow, we don't want to have a bunch of really fancy sensors everywhere if we want this to be like a low-cost, robust vehicle. Those were two other pretty concrete learnings.
Yeah, it was also just such an adventure. Like, it was super fun. I think you could talk about this a little
Sure,
bit too.
yeah. I guess, it's not like a learning, but it was a great way for Ben and I to like really return to, because we had never really done that kind of thing together, like gone like full throttle together. Like at Zipline, we weren't on the same project, but we had a lot of like just fun brainstorms that night. This was like time for like us to like just be ourselves and just really relish in like the fact that we love working insanely hard and just hitting the throttle. So,
Building real things with your hands.
yeah, it was so tangible.
Yeah.
So I think, the craziest week we had, if I remember correctly, I think Monday we worked 19 hours and then slept a little bit and then worked all day Tuesday. We pulled an all-nighter Tuesday night, straight into driving 14 hours to Oregon. And then
like
during
in
that
the morning, like
during
we
that
didn't sleep
drive,
and then we left.
Yeah.
And we were already late. It was terrible.
And then during that drive, we like took turns napping and driving. And then so Wednesday night we arrive in Oregon.
While writing code on the drive, by the way.
Yeah.
Like that's why we were taking turns, because it still wasn't finished.
I think we had to pick up radio receivers on the way as well.
Oh,
so we stopped in San Francisco. We bought some radio receivers and we got on Craigslist and then kept going to Oregon because we realized the radio receivers we have weren't powerful enough.
Yeah, it's maximum startup vibes right there.
Yeah, so then Wednesday
uncomfortably
night,
so, actually.
Yeah, it was insane. And then Wednesday night we get there and we have to immediately start setting up the test because we have to be ready Thursday morning to kick off. So I have this great photo of Ben in like a sleeping bag, like coding, like because like some of the code still didn't really work. So we're like, it's like in the middle of a farm field in Oregon that some guy let us use, and we're like hacking everything, trying to get it working. 5 a.m, we're like ready to go. Suddenly, like totally unexpected fog layer comes out of nowhere. So we have to unpack everything and undo everything and pack it all up again. We get sleep Thursday night. Finally, like Thursday, we actually sleep
A little bit. We
day.
slept from like the afternoon to later in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't, because we had to go and set up again in a totally different place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I woke up and broke my nose.
How?
This is a great story.
I need myself in the face, but it's complicated.
I'll take your word for it.
It's a whole thing.
I thought you were fighting a shark.
Yeah. But we had to I had to turn off however that felt because we had to test Friday morning. So after breaking my nose, we go back out to set up the test again, and finally we test Friday. But yeah, I think that was probably the most insane week we've ever had.
See, like obviously in the moment parts of that really aren't fun, but like a huge part of doing S3 is to like try to like get people to understand just how fun and crazy like building hard things can be, like or early startup days like this. And I feel like, you know, these are stories that like in a biography one day, like people will like relish and be like, they're crazy, or like this is amazing. Like of course they were going to be successful, but like that's the magic of it, is like times when you do these crazy sprints and stuff. And like I appreciate you sharing that. Like I think those kind of stories are the things that are like super inspiring for people, especially because it's like at the end of the day, you're building stuff with your friends and trying to make something work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just like working on new stuff.
Right.
It's all the like little in-between layers too, like all the little like random subcomponents that you build up at the office, and
Right.
like all the little tiny successes along the way. And then you're like, you know, you go drive out to somewhere really cool, like rent a U-Haul, like, I don't know, go into the craziest place ever, and like,
Right.
yeah, try it out. And like usually it doesn't work. Like that was one test out of 7, and all of the other tests were kind of the same story. Like
Yeah,
we were always
so
like
many
way
things go wrong.
like we were always way too late. It was always coming way too soon, and it always had to be that day because like the weather would be bad for the next couple of days. So like there's always like this pressure that's coming on you, and you like, I don't know, you just have to like grind and get the thing done and like work super hard. And like I really missed hot air balloon testing. Like that was just like unbelievably fun. Like it was terrible while we were doing it, and like, yeah, everybody hated me and like was really concerned. And, like, you know, your family calls you and they're like, hey, you're not sleeping or eating, and like you look terrible, and like all your muscles are gone, and like and like
The greatest tragedy of them all.
But there's a mirror pointing stuff at solar arrays, and it's working.
yeah. It's like, come on guys, we can just get it if we do it this time.
There's no better feeling than like cheering your head off when it works for the first time. Like I had many moments of that, like Zipline, Zipline, where it was just like the thing worked for the first time. This felt like that too, where it's just like, oh my god, like it worked.
Well, I love we even like, because you guys record stuff, which like I tell all the founders we film with, like record stuff or call us to record it. Like you guys did a really great job of recording the balloon test. And, like your audio being like,
That's
oh
all
my
Ben.
god. Yeah, it's like, well, so that's a great transition into like my next question, which is like, you guys are experienced builders, and I'm curious, like if you could share kind of your background, like one of you ran a YouTube channel, one of you worked for a very long time at Zipline. Well, both of you technically did, but like you guys have really interesting backgrounds, and I'd love to hear a bit more of what they were before founding.
I guess before this, I was finishing freshman year at Stanford. That's.
What were you doing as a kid though? Like, were you interested in like space stuff or like, yeah?
I mean, I think it's like it's the classic engineering thing where it's like, for as long as you remember, you love building things. I mean, that's always where it started. I think where it really started was I was obsessed with fighter jets when I was a little kid. My dad would build me like these little models. I'd always like ask him like, can you build this to me? And we had like a little wood shop, and he'd help me make them. So I think that honestly was like a kickoff of like, oh, you can actually build things. I think where it really took off was when in fifth grade, I just had a desire to make a quadcopter from scratch. And this was kind of in like 2012 still, when like quadcopters were still weird, and you would make them out of like plywood sticks and Tupperware containers. And figuring that out on my own for the first time was like, oh wow, I can say I want to have something, and I can go and then build it. And that completely led to what is it called? The Rube Goldberg machine of like one project leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. And I think my life thus far has just been like a continuation of that one moment where I was like, I think I want to try to build a quadcopter. And like, it just, it was, I think I got very lucky that I stumbled on that desire, because it was just, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was everything I wanted to do always. And I think, during school, it was hard to always make it my priority. But when I graduated high school and realized I could kind of do whatever I wanted, and COVID hit too, I decided that it would be a lot more fun to actually start working on things and building things 24/7. So I started working at Zipline, and that was really like the big opening to the whole world, where I realized,
What is Zipline for people who don't know?
Zipline's a drone delivery company. They deliver medical products across Africa right now and in the U.S. I was obsessed with them when I was a kid because they were the drone company doing everything like real. Like most drone companies, aside from like DJI, were like not really doing that much. Zipline was actually like the company in the field using drones for super cool reasons. So I always wanted to work there. I remember the moment when I decided to apply, I was looking at the job page for fun, and I was like, looking at the description, I was like, I think I could do some of these things. So I emailed Keller, and the kind of magic kind of happened after that. But
So what did you work on while you were there mostly?
when I first worked at Zipline in high school as a little intern. But when I came back after high school, I was on the early Platform 2 team, leading the development of the delivery droid, there's a couple, I think Mark Rober did a YouTube video on it. That's a little package that can actively control its location to deliver things super precisely. And that was one of the coolest things I've ever worked on, because it was just totally new. There's nothing quite like it. It's not many times that you get to work on something that flies that has no precedent. So it's completely from scratch, which taught me so much about what it takes to go from, we want to do this thing and have a design that works in the real world. And it has to be simple, and it's just, there's no precedent. It's a void you're wandering into. So absolutely magical experience. I think I got really lucky that I happened to join Zipline when they were kicking off that whole next phase of their company.
I think Tristan also made his own luck.
Totally.
When I was there, he was working harder than like all the full-time engineers, just like grinding on this thing, like iterating like crazy. Like it was really impressive.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I knew when I left, it would kind of be like a fall from heaven in many ways. Like there was something just magically perfect about that time in my life. Starting Reflect with Ben, I think, is like my way to get back to how that felt. And so far, it's definitely exceeding the expectations.
That's amazing.
A whole new world.
So you guys met at Zipline, but what were you doing before you went to go apply at Zipline?
Yeah, I have a long history of building things. I kind of had reverse writer's block when I was really young, which meant like every cool idea I had to go and try it immediately.
Yeah.
And kind of the crazier and harder it seemed, like the more enticing it was, and like maybe I should work on that first.
Which sort of sounds fake until you watch your YouTube channel trailer, which is just basically being like, I built this thing, and you're like, no way. And then you say like another thing, you're like, yeah, okay, like you built two things, and then you keep going. And then at some point you're like, oh, I built a fusion reactor. And you're like, well, did he say? And then you're looking like, no, he said that and he did that. Like your YouTube channel is insane. It's terrifying.
It was a lot of fun. I don't know. I had time for some reason in high school because I didn't really care that much about classes. And I was like, oh, this seems like so much cooler to go like build this thing. And I got into this cycle where I was like really good at coming up with reasons why I should build something, and I got like pretty good at convincing people that like I should probably go and work on that thing. And then like after I'd build one or two things, people were like, actually maybe you should go work on that thing. So it was like, yeah, this vicious cycle. Then I got to build a lot of stuff. But then I remember one month I used like a whole megawatt of electricity. My dad was pretty mad about that. It was like,
how much does a megawatt roughly cost like today?
Like $400. Like to make it, it's only like 80, but
the cost.
There's his cost, because we were in like this small town in Cape Cod, and like it wasn't like that crazy. It's like a month and a half of normal electricity use, but it was surprising, and it's one of those things that you can very easily Google to compare it to other things, and it's like, okay, how many gallons of gas does it take to make a megawatt hour? And it's like, how much coal does it take to make a megawatt hour, or like how much uranium do you have to mine to make a megawatt hour? And it's like, oh wow, it's actually like kind of a lot, and it's like, how am I going to continue building all this stuff without using more energy? And like, it was this huge crisis, right? And I was like, wait, am I like...
Which is like, that is like a industry level question, like massive companies ask, but you were asking that question as like a kid at like, what, 15, 16?
Yeah, pretty young. Yeah, like 16, 17.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and I like, I started calculating it. It's like one of those really hard problems, and it's like, oh, it turns out the whole world hasn't figured out the solution to this.
Yeah.
And like, oh, wow. The whole world really needs to figure out a solution to this, because like not like the U.S. has tons of energy, right? Like we can run ACs all winter, like blah blah blah. But like in India, people don't use ACs all the time because it's really expensive and they just don't have access to the energy. And if you were going to make people have access to the energy, it'd come from coal or nuclear or not nuclear, it'd come from coal or fossil fuels or something, kind of terrible. And everybody here kind of balks when China builds a new giant coal power plant, but you kind of have to industrialize. You can't really have lots of energy and clean access to it without, doing something. And it turns out doing something is usually terrible. You usually have to burn something or do something awful. And it's okay, wow. So energy is a really big problem. And that's kind of where that's where I got interested in nuclear fusion, because everybody's oh, this is the future. People will build fusion reactors and then energy is going to be solved and the world's going to get better. Well, I don't know. I built that fusion reactor kind of I was kind of curious. I knew it wasn't going to work. It was a Farnsworth fuser. No, everybody knows they don't work, but it was kind of okay, I want to learn more about this and see kind of what it feels like to build it. In doing that, I realized the way the sun does fusion is actually very simple. It's really heavy. So it's so heavy that it just pushes atoms together. On Earth, we can't make something that heavy, so we have to do other stuff that's usually pretty complicated. And turns out it's really complicated and not very good, or at least in my opinion. And I was okay, I actually don't really want to work on fusion. It seems it's too complicated.
Problem.
Yeah, it's one of those complicated things that might not actually get to the solution quickly. And there's so many other better ways to make fusion. For example, the sun is just doing it already. We don't even have to replace that. So that was I don't know. I kind of had that experience, and I obviously had reverse writer's block. After that, I don't know. I had obviously this love of building things, love of working extremely hard. And then I was okay, who's building the hardest, coolest thing? It's clear answer for me was SpaceX. Okay, I'm gonna figure out how to get a job there. So I was okay, I guess I do have to go to college.
This is what year roughly? And
2016. Yeah, it was my freshman year of college.
How many launches had Falcon 9 done, or had they done really many at that point?
I think they had done one landing that worked.
Yeah, so
before they put the booster up.
I always calling out when people start working at SpaceX, because I think in the past few years, everyone's oh, SpaceX is the obvious cool place to work. But before, I think 2019, give or take, it was kind of sketchy to work there. Or it was not as much of a sure bet as it is today. The average person's oh my God, SpaceX. But back then, or especially even earlier employees, people don't understand how much of a risk it was to work there, or how novel it was. So and even though that wasn't one of the first very employees, it's still early. Today they have hundreds of launches and relandings. Back then they, as you said, only had one.
Yeah. It was pretty early. It was crazy, and everybody would freak out every time they landed a rocket too. Everybody would go down and watch it and be biting their nails. You'd be really scared that thing was going to blow up. Right. And then by the time I left, because I did that one summer and then I went back the year after. And by that time, it was already normal. People didn't really go watch launches anymore. They're yeah, it's just a thing that happens. And now it's just completely different, where people don't even know when they're launching. And it's happening constantly. And they're kind of in this new tale where it's they're encountering problems that nobody else is encountering because they're on flight 100 or something like that. You're oh, there's this weird issue that happens 1 in 100 flights, and here's the solution for it. Yeah. You're not going to understand that unless you've done 100 launches. So they're so far ahead, and they have this huge moat. And it was incredibly cool to work there. So I worked on the Dragon vehicle, which is the thing that brings astronauts up to the International Space Station. And I worked on the Crew vehicle a little bit too, which is the vehicle before that, which was for resupplying the International Space Station. And that was pretty cool because it was SpaceX, but it was a little bit more serious because everything basically had to fit NASA standards. Right. So that was a pretty cool technology. And it was this whole vehicle that could fly itself, and it can stay in space for several months if it needs to. It was this cool vehicle that could completely fly itself in space and dock with the International Space Station and then, come back down. And I got to work on some really cool parts over there. And basically, one of the main reasons I wanted to work at SpaceX is I saw that intern video where they said they let people work on way too much hardware. They gave people way too much ownership. You could work on any part, and your thing would actually go to space as an intern. You wouldn't just be delivering coffee or something. And that really got me. It was oh yeah, I want to be doing that. I want to
That's
work on
also
really
our
hard
intern
things.
policy.
Yeah.
You're not going to deliver coffee here.
Yeah, at least what a terrible idea.
So then how did you get from SpaceX to Zipline?
Yeah, so SpaceX was amazing, but there's a lot of people working there who are really smart, smarter than me. And it's going to work just because there's a lot of really smart people already working there. I was basically adding nothing. Or I was, doing work, but it was
You wanted to do more. You wanted to contribute in a big way.
I wanted to be a bigger part of something crazy because I knew I had this talent of building things and just starting stuff and going very much from zero to something that kind of works and just trying a million things. So I really took an interest in startups and working on brand new things that are super hard. And I figured the harder the problem, the more experience I build. And it's kind of like, the harder it is, the more you're going to learn. So I was like, okay, I want to work at like some really crazy places. And I worked at a couple really crazy places, and I was like, oh wow, maybe this is too crazy. And it was actually like very humbling. I was like, oh, I can't solve everything. Like there are some problems that people are trying to solve that are literally impossible, or like not literally impossible, but very like the market is not large enough to justify the existence of the company.
Sure.
That happens a lot.
Yeah.
And that was a very hard learned lesson.
You sort of get to the frontier of capitalism at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're like, oh man, this thing is only worth like a couple $1 million a year. Like, this is just not even worth working on.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So that's like the ultimate kind of killer. And then Zipline was like this really big company doing super cool stuff with drones. And I was like, I had a long history with drones. I built them since like 2009, actually. That was also one of the reasons that I got into building, actually, was like building drones and like flying them around. And
This is what happens when the drone kids grow up.
yeah.
There's also Neuros too. It's like the drone kids, and they all
feature them in
like
S3
growing
too.
up now.
Yeah.
What are the kids building nowadays? That will be the future, like people building things. Are they still building drones? What do you think they're building now? It seems like they're building a lot of like AI computers in Minecraft.
I don't know.
Yeah. Honestly, the redstone computers in Minecraft, I built one of those too. Yeah. There's something about like these Minecraft videos. I don't know, man. Like people spend like 9 months doing some.
They're ridiculously impressive.
It's
like on the
crazy.
one hand, I simultaneously think this is the most impressive thing I've ever seen, and this is the biggest waste of time I've ever seen.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not sure where the actual like truth is there.
I know.
It's somewhere. It's a superposition for sure.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, I had a Minecraft YouTube channel for a minute.
Ben N builds a Minecraft. Yeah.
Different name. But it was like, it was not successful. But it was, I don't know, it's like that thing where it's like, I just kind of want to like sit on this computer for like 3 days straight and just like make this thing for no reason.
To this day, me and my friends have like a Christmas like Minecraft LAN party every year.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
such a
Like
good
we
idea.
honestly, we should do like a founder one. Like that's like
That's
in
a
someone's
great
factory every.
idea.
But like we do it, and it's basically like two all-nighters, and we sleep a little bit. But like we go from 0 to 1 on building some server. So like we should actually do that.
It would be pretty fun.
Anyways,
Yeah. Definitely distracting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have not touched Minecraft since then.
Sure.
It was like a very clear decision where I
Well,
was
yeah,
like,
I never play video games except that time of the year.
Yeah.
And then like Age of Empires if I get extremely sick. That's it. But like those are the 2 times I play video games a year, pretty much.
yeah, it's
I think
hard
Cat
to.
has replaced Minecraft these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very fair. Very fair. For me, it was Wonder, but yeah, very fair.
Yeah. CAD was a little after my time, which was kind of weird. Or like good CAD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
I was very much like woodworking, just like
Yeah.
sitting there.
Very,
Yeah.
very fair.
Yeah.
So the kids are building things in Minecraft. What else? Are they doing anything else? We're missing anything here?
I feel like the kids these days are missing the quadcopter. I don't know. There was like 10
Have
years
a way to actually interface with
between
the
like
real world.
2010 and 2020 when like it was like the development of like remote control things.
Yeah.
I
I feel like today's 3D printing maybe, but like 3D printing is just a platform. It's not an actual like end thing that you can then
Yeah,
go
it's
apply.
it's hard. I think drones are now
Yeah.
too commodified for it to be something that people consider to be like scratch buildy.
Yeah.
But like back when it was that, like a lot of extremely hard problems, like a lot of the controls problems were solved by super smart people who open sourced everything.
Right.
Which meant you could focus on like vehicle design and a lot of just like performance things and a lot of more mechanical and aerospace oriented things.
And I think it not being fully solved probably made people feel like they were like doing something new, which was
yeah,
inspiring.
no,
versus,
that
it's
was like the engaging piece. So, like when the
Yeah.
thing worked, you're like, oh my god, this is like not just normal. It's like it's actually flying. Like I was obsessed with the idea of like putting a camera high up in the sky. Like that was before that was
because that
a
wasn't
thing.
done back then.
It was
yeah.
like the coolest thing ever. Like when I got my first picture from a thing I built,
Yeah.
and it was like 100 feet up, and I was like,
Yeah.
I took that photo. It was like to do this otherwise, I would have had to have like a Cessna or like a plane.
Right. Well, I remember for me, like, because like as a filmmaker, I think it was like 13 or 14. I like bought the first Phantom, and this is back when you had to install a custom separately bought gimbal with the GoPro.
Oh, yeah.
And I had this like janky RF extender, and like flew like way past the like recommended limit with like because I put it like on a C stand and put it up super high, but like. I remember being like, this is insane. Like, this is a camera in the sky that's on an airplane. And I was like, but you're right. Now it's just so like, well, of course.
But it's such a good platform because it's in reality. So you build this thing and then you can use it.
Yeah.
And it's not like it's not like an RC car in that it's like
Right.
on the ground. Like there's a lot that can go wrong. So you learn so much just
Yeah.
about ways things can fail, why things don't.
There's like multidimensionality, controls, like software.
Dynamics is super interesting, specing the propulsion system. Like all of these things matter. And it's like the perfect starter thing. I don't know.
What do kids have today?
There's like robot dogs, kind of. Like there's all like the
Oh, like the
MIT
little-
Maker kids. Oh, like they are so impressive.
The maker
Yeah.
portfolios.
Yeah.
Yeah. The most common thing we were looking because we were kind of like I think I went through every single one of them on YouTube looking for interns. And the most common project I saw was the like machine learning robot dog. where like someone like 3D printed like a little version of Spot and like trained like some machine learning thing on it to teach it how to walk. That's becoming very common.
Those motors are so cheap now.
That's insane. Like each generation, like each decade, it's just going to get even crazier. Like to us, that's sort of insane. But like you can imagine going like 100 years to like back then that would have been like people building like Ford and those people. Even like people are going to use software. Like what is software to ML control? What is just like this just totally different level of like and it's going to cost like much cheaper than the car you're building. Much cheaper.
I will say it just popped in my head. I think maybe the equivalent of quadcopters right now is self-landing RC rockets.
Yeah.
I'm seeing so many people make these like guided rockets basically.
Yeah. Well, Joe Barnard like proved that you could sort of do this by yourself and self-landing it, and then like now a ton of people are starting to do it.
I see so many kids making like little, even if they're propeller controlled, like just like hovering rockets.
Yeah. Well, like now I saw Joe Barnard tweeted yesterday. He was like, hey guys, like please copy my work, but like please be safe. like, and also like he's getting to the point now where like he's making solid rocket fuel and motors himself and doing things with rocketry that like the government with export control is having to sign off on for him.
Oh,
like,
wow.
As a YouTuber, this is insane. Like that's so cool that like we've like commodified essentially the parts to be able to do this and like the capabilities and the knowledge to be able to do this. Like that a single man doing YouTube can like do stuff like that is amazing.
Yeah. I think the next thing might be satellites. Like I'm really hopeful for that.
CubeSats, definitely.
I can't wait for the first person to make their own rocket and also send their own CubeSat into space. Has it been done before?
I think Joe Barnard's gonna be the first.
Maybe, yeah.
I think he's going for a space shot, and I don't see why he would stop to then like not start putting payloads in space.
In my head, that's like the coolest personal project. Like you get your own satellite into space with your own little launch vehicle. Oh my god!
I would personally buy space on a BPS vehicle just to put something in space. I don't know what it would be, but something just to be like.
Anything. Yeah, if you could have a vehicle in space that could fly anywhere, that would be kind of the ultimate thing.
Insane.
Too. Like that'd be like the quadcopter thing. Where it's not only you have to build it, but you get to explore.
There's like SSSs, student like space stations that are just like different talking. That's insane.
No, we talk about like quadcopters in space a lot. I think going back to like your a question a long time ago about like the cost of the satellite. Because we're like quadcopter kids, we really think about the satellite like a quadcopter.
Right.
And like the question we ask us all the time is like, why does the satellite have to be much more complicated than a quadcopter?
Right.
And there's
Like
very
really,
reasons.
Yeah, really why? Like, hey, like come on.
there are very like legit reasons.
Yeah.
No, and there's like a company we featured, Orbital Composites. I don't remember what episode number was. They have the same view. They started building drones and helicopters, and then they were like, we don't see why you can't build satellites the same way. Yeah. And like, there's a few things like radiation and thermal, but beyond that, like theoretically, you should be able to.
Especially at scale, and especially when you're learning things enough in the operational environment. That's the key. It's like iterate in the operational environment. It's hard to do that with space right now, but it's getting easier. Like we're considering a world where we use like 1U test box, where we take a little 1U, cram it full of stuff, send it into space to test stuff, get like space hardware or space heritage, which is like cheap little 1Us you can send up super easily.
I think you're right. That's actually kind of terrifying to imagine that like this next decade or the decade after, for sure, their version of like quadcopters will be freaking satellites.
Possibly.
You kind of have to force it into existence too.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where like everybody's like, oh, spaceflight's really expensive, so we got to make the satellite really expensive so we don't waste that launch.
It's a flywheel, but it's changing. Yeah.
But in the future, if it's going to be cheaper, it's like, well, I can make the vehicle really cheap and it won't matter. So you kind of have to do it now where you're like, okay, what if we made the vehicle really cheap and just kind of like ate the cost of launch?
Case in point being like, SpaceX like eating the cost of transport emissions, or now we're having other like launch providers coming online, like Rocket Lab and Stoke potentially, and other companies, and like it's just going to get cheaper and cheaper over time, which is like super cool.
Yeah, I think the other thing is once more people know that there's cheap launch available, they're going to have more ideas.
Right.
Like once you're like, oh wait, Starship's going to exist one day. I could do this idea. Like the economics of this might start closing, or like, oh, this would be really fun, or like, oh, I could launch this gigantic thing that would otherwise be impossible. Yeah. And once more people start doing that, then the launch companies are like, oh, guys. There's like a really real industry now. And like it's not just Starlink. It's not just this other stuff.
But this is one of those things where like humans are super bad at conceiving exponentials, and especially bad at conceiving exponentials that aren't very quantifiable. So like, the extent to which people are going to be inspired, like very hard to quantify, but that is like an exponential thing. Yep. Like Ben talked about like some of the bets we're taking, like the bet that like spaceflight's going to become just way more than we ever think it's currently going to be is like, seems very possible given that we're just terrible at predicting these kinds of things, and it's so high potential. Like it's the ocean that we haven't explored yet. There's so much utility.
Well, and it's super interesting too, because if you think about like, as I was like flying in today to do this interview, I was like just sort of mind boggled by how normal commercial flight is. And I think it's like however many 100,000 flights happen. I don't remember.
Oh yeah, there's like 7,000 planes in the air at any given time.
Yeah, it's truly insane. And so to think that like 100 years ago, that was insane. And like and basically the most of the reason is like leisure and business travel. Like, but like there's a huge part of it is cargo as well. But like, it's very like kind of dumb things. Like most of the time people like want to go on a vacation or visit their family. Like it's not like we need to do this thing to like in like I can't help but imagine why space travel would be super different. Or like that there wouldn't be other things we can't even predict today that like the original inventors like wouldn't have been able to predict.
Yeah, 100%. Like once something becomes cheap enough, you can just use it for dumb reasons.
Yeah.
Like electricity, like if you had just free electricity, you would use it for really dumb reasons. If spaceflight was just free, you would use it for really dumb reasons.
Well,
and you need to have that freedom, like in order to have the right ideas. And that's how...
Because it opens up the envelope for inspiration. And that's something I think you said in the episode or in some cut of it where I think you said like, we want a future where like you don't have to worry or think about the cost of having a light bulb always on or like electrical things always on. And like most... Like we really can't consider yet full energy abundance as a species. Like we don't have it yet, and like that will, in much in the way that cheap spaceflight will change what people's minds on like what can be built. I think energy is absolutely going to be that same way too. Like this new dream of like free, abundant energy is like super exciting.
Yeah, and a lot of people have talked about that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those exciting things where it's like all of a sudden you can refine any material you want and just like fully burn everything off with electricity and just like basically separate it atom by atom.
Yeah.
Like you can just electrolyze water.
Yeah.
Like make it clean, just like pure vapor distillation. Like you can just use it for any kind of transportation. I mean, transportation's hard because you have to store it, and it's pretty lossy to store it. But it's like, oh, if it's free, the losses actually just don't matter. Okay, we have hydrogen everywhere. Like we can use that for all our planes. Like here we go. Like it's the ultimate clean solution.
There's also this like
crazy.
There's this huge well that we're filling, which is the sheer quantity of people who want to live a high energy lifestyle right now. I think this is one of the biggest areas where I think we're going to see a lot of innovation is generally like the billions of people in the world who want to live like current millions right now.
Yeah.
I think we're all very lucky to live in a world where you can basically press buttons and have anything happen.
Yep.
But this is a world that's built off of an insane amount of fossil fuels.
Yep. And it doesn't grow well without.
Yeah, well, the
Yeah.
entire world sees this and they're like, okay, we want this too.
Right. As they should.
They cannot use fossil fuels. So we
Right.
have this problem where we need to use way more energy, not even to just do like novel things, it's just to get the rest of the world up to speed.
Yeah.
And it has to be clean. And
Yeah.
it's a giant void right now.
This is sort of something like I get pretty frustrated with when I think about like a lot of people today who sort of live a very privileged life and like don't realize it and kind of take it for granted and like to like tear down technology a lot when it's like no, the life you're living is insanely nice and like you are in the 1% already living it like compared to the rest of the world.
A lot of people complain these days, like, where's innovation? Like,
Yeah.
it feels like things have stopped. Like, there's no, like, the new road or, like, the new thing that's like an airplane, but it's new. You know, like, that new whole category of things. And I think the reason is because we don't actually need that much more. And we continually invent for the most privileged people in the world.
Yeah.
The reality is, I think most of the innovation is going to become from inventing things for the like billions of people who want to get up to speed, because that's not just like a reapplication of existing tech. It's
Right.
going to be complete reinventions of everything we have, so
Yeah.
that it's sustainable, it doesn't destroy the earth, and also it can support just way more people than we think could possibly exist.
Yeah.
Like to me, like that's where all the coolest new stuff is going to exist. Like I think Zipline's an example of this. Like
You guys are too with the idea of like can we provide sunlight where it's needed in solar farms?
we're not a solution for the first world. We're the solution for the entire world.
Right.
And like we work because we're a solution for the entire world. Like
Yeah.
Zipline's a similar thing. Like you couldn't just slap like a delivery service into Rwanda. Like it needed something new, like entirely novel, because the world is very diverse and different and crazy. So I think most of the coolest things are going to come from focusing on that whole area.
Agreed. I think about a lot like how do we get more people inspired and excited about the future and building the future? And I'm curious. I sort of have like a split mind about it. On the one hand, I'm like, oh, we need more like content and media and hype around this sort of thing. Like, obviously, that's a big part of what I believe doing what I do. On the other hand, I'm like, not really. We kind of just need people building things that inspire other people to build things. Like Elon building SpaceX and Tesla and things inspires you guys to build, or like it inspires all of us, and then you guys go and inspire more people. So I go back and forth on this a lot too. But I'm curious what other things you think are important to getting people more excited about the future.
Yeah, I think something that many people don't really appreciate is the extent to which a lot of the world that surrounds us is a local minimum. So there's a lot of solutions around us that work. And I think people don't realize the extent to which you can question those solutions and things can be very different because global maximums exist. You know, a lot of things work in society. They're not awesome, though. And if you really rethink things from first principles, you can realize that there are way better solutions out there that we're not really considering just because it would be too costly to deconstruct the current way of doing things. That's not super ideal.
Yeah.
So I think a mindset that I found very helpful when working on crazy things is to appreciate that like things can be completely different, like just so different, and really, really embracing the fact that things can just be unlike anything that currently exists right now, and that's totally okay, and that solution space is open. I think in a world that works as well as it does right now, it's very easy to think that everything's solved, but I think it's better to view it as a configuration in a much larger solution space. And oftentimes that configuration happens to be at like a local minimum as opposed to like a global maximum. And it's important to chase these global maximums because every time someone uncovers a global maximum, like it's a step change in life. Like I think Ben has a good example with like the nitrogen guy or like the fertilizer guy.
Yeah.
But like, it's very important to chase these global maximums. I think Reflect is like a global maximum that we're chasing.
Can you like give some other examples of global maximums, or like how do people find more of them to get excited about?
I mean, SpaceX is like totally a global maximum. Like they were like, we need to go to space. It's important that we go to space. It's important that we try to make life multiplanetary. You know, space existed, space launch existed, but I think it was stuck at a local minimum of like, okay, well, it's kind of complicated, and NASA mostly does it, and it's kind of for fringe things that are not that monetarily useful, unless you have like large constellations like GPS or something. But SpaceX was like, there's something we're completely missing here, which is if we actually can get to space really easily, all of a sudden, all of these totally new capabilities are unlocked. So chasing this global maximum where it's like, actually, we should just try to make space way better without regard for the fact that NASA had been doing it for, you know, many, many, many decades. And it was always kind of complicated and expensive and heavy and like this insane thing. I think that's a great example. You should talk about that guy, the nitrogen. I don't. You say it better.
Yeah. Well, the most inspiring thing for me is realizing that people have faced impossible problems in the past, and most people are like, "Yeah, this is impossible. Like, there's no solution. There's no way forward. The world's going to end. Like, it's this crisis. Everybody's going to die."
Yep.
And then somebody came along, put their socks on in the morning, and they like did some work, and they figured it out, and it was like the complete solution.
Yeah.
And that's happened like over and over again through history. And I haven't really lived through a huge one of those. Like we've lived through a couple. Like, I think SpaceX is like a really big one, but I don't think we've lived through a gigantic one. Mm-hmm. One thing that I really like thinking about is Fritz Haber and how he came up with synthetic ammonia. And it is the reason that 70% of the nitrogen is in your body. And it's the reason like billions of people were able to exist instead of having a gigantic farming crisis.
Yeah.
But I was watching this documentary and it was like before he came along, the world was going to end. We were like going to random islands in the middle of the ocean to mine bird poop to get ammonia to use in our fertilizer. And it was just completely crazy. And it was one of those hair on fire things. Like the global population is going to stop. Like progress is going to end. Like we're not going to be able to farm anymore. Like the soil is going to run out and like we will have no more food and there'll be mass famines and everybody's going to die. And then, he came up with a solution that was pretty simple, worked pretty well. It was pretty cheap. It took him a long time to figure it out. Like it was pretty hard, it seems.
And now less than 2% of the population works on farming, I believe. A number could be wrong, but it's a very low number.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it's like farming's pretty solved now.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's going to happen again. I think it's happening right now with global energy. It's like, the world's going to end. Like population's going to stagnate. We're not going to be able to continue to grow. Like, sorry, rest of the world, like you can't get to where the U.S. is, but like also we're going to continue using this, and like it's going to be forever. Like we're going to have to burn all of this fossil fuel forever, and there's no end.
Yeah, we're like very stuck in local configurations. We're like, okay, fusion, nuclear, like solar, wind, like renewable energy combo. Actually, wait, no, sorry, fusion. Nuclear. Like we're just kind of like stuck in the thing. It's like we need to find the totally new reinvention that's way better and way crazier that we've never considered before.
Yeah. It's pretty hard to do that too. Like, it's pretty hard to come up with like a completely new thing. And the other thing, like, a lot of companies are like, okay, we have this new idea, like it's new. We're going to figure out how to sell it. And I think that's completely the wrong approach because most things that are new are actually terrible ideas. and actually don't work at all. Like there's way more, if you look at them, like there's way more incorrect ways to do something than correct ways to do something.
Yeah.
Almost always. So like if you're just like coming up with random ideas, like something will look new, but it's actually not useful at all. Like coming up with something that's new and useful is incredibly difficult. Usually the useful things are already kind of in a lot of places, but they're just like not really seen.
Well, it's like that common, I think, deep tech sort of like startup idea, which is like you are either one of two companies. You are, if the impossible thing you make works, everyone will buy it and there's no concern about it being bought. Or if you make it, maybe people buy it, but like you're actually not sure. Like consumer hardware can fall into that category a lot. It can be really freaking hard to build, but like you don't actually know if people want it.
Yeah.
A lot of these hardware companies fall into a trap, which is like, cool thing. Okay, let's figure out how to monetize it.
Yeah.
That's so tempting for people who like to build cool hardware because it's cool. Most drone companies fall into this problem where it's like, we have a cool drone. Okay, let's use it. And like,
Is there a need? Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like you just have to go through lots and lots of ideas. So you kind of have to develop these like two things where one, you're coming up with like the most creative solutions ever, but then two, you're getting extremely good at killing them. And like, especially killing them really, really quickly. Like the faster you can kill the good ideas, the more good ideas you can have.
Right.
Because you kind of never move on and have a new idea until you've killed like the best idea you have right now. Like the best idea you have right now probably is actually stupid, but you just haven't figured it out yet. And I think that's the case for a very long time. I think until you've done like 50 plus iterations or more than that, like maybe a couple hundred, you haven't had a good idea yet. Like you literally just haven't. And like
the iteration thing is so important.
Yeah.
I think what I would add to that too is like, I think you really need to look for things that are not inevitable. I think a lot of things right now feel very inevitable. Like a framework that I really like is I try to look for things that are like maximally creative, that are also maximally useful, that are not inevitable.
Yeah.
And that's generally going to define what I work on. And I think that's like a good thing to iterate in. Like I think Ben iterates in this a lot. I iterate in this a lot. It's just a great way to like focus your brain on things that are not just going to happen anyways because people are already thinking about them.
Yeah. I think
It's a way to find those global maximums.
it's also important, like, you're talking about global maximums. You can kind of figure out what the global maximum is going to be. Or, like, if your idea belongs at the global maximum level. Like, I consume a ridiculous amount of information. I look into every new thing that I hear about, and I try to figure out, like, exactly what's going on with it. And, like, sometimes that means, like, buying it on eBay and taking it apart or whatever. But I have to figure out how the thing works. I have to know everything about it. And then I kind of, like, rate everything. And there's this kind of thing where it's, like, it's not a particular scale. But if you can compare one thing to another thing and figure out which thing's better on a particular scale, you can sort the entire set of everything. So you can look at you can build up this huge library of everything that's like been built and like how it was built and like kind of sort everything and be like, this is like the hardest thing in this category, or like this is like the best thing in this category, or like this is the cleanest thing in this category.
Yeah.
And you can kind of like build up this network of like, okay, this is like what's out in the world. And then when you have a new idea, you can compare it to everything else. You can be like, how does this compare on manufacturability with everything else that's manufactured?
It's like a mental lattice work, but for engineering.
Yeah. And how easy is this thing to build? Or like how big is this market compared to every other market that's out there? And you can kind of like do all these crazy comparisons. And you really have to put every single idea through every single comparison you have, and then also get really good at making better comparisons, but then also get really good at like figuring out the math for things. Because you can also just do the math on something and be like, okay, how does this rate on like the LCOE of electricity? Like, great scale. Can it be cheaper than everything else? If not, it's probably not going to work. That's a pretty big one. The other one is like, is this market big enough to like be attractive for people to work on? Like, is this going to be something that 20,000 people can work on, or 100,000 people can work on one day? Or is this something that only like 2 or 3 people can work on? Like, does the idea support all of this lifestyle?
Yeah.
That's another huge one. That kills a lot of ideas. Like, a lot of ideas cannot actually support that many people. It's not that big of an edge. So you can really come up with these things, and it's like you can also get pretty methodical about how you're coming up with the new ideas as well, because you want to come up with as many ideas as possible. And as Tristan was saying, you want them to be like extreme outliers on these scales. So you can kind of like just put in a lot of work on these two things, like just coming up with more ideas, and then like putting in tons of work on like killing them as quickly as possible, so you can have even more. And then just doing that over and over again gets you pretty far.
Well, my last question for you guys is, what is your current life philosophy?
I think there's 2 things that guide my thinking at the highest level right now. I think I really prioritize what I want to do, especially when it means I sacrifice things for it. And I really respect the extent to which time is the only limited thing, really. I think those two things guide most of everything that I do. I'm really clear about what I want to do, and I especially will chase that thing if it means I have to sacrifice a lot for it, because that usually means it's like a really good thing to chase. And it also means that you're very focused. And then I'm very cognizant of how I'm spending my time, because that's actually the really limited quantity. There's nowhere in the universe you can get more time. You can get more gold in the universe, always. Like, there's so much gold in the universe, but like, there's nowhere you can go to get more time. It's like, it is the thing that is always running out. So framing things in terms of how you spend your time, that's been a really big one for me. How you spend your time frames everything in your life.
The time is everything.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's your time, and like, the time is all yours to spend effectively, and you can choose, or you can spend a lot of that time doing things you don't want to do. To me, it makes no sense why you would do that. Like, if you're given time to spend, why would you spend that time doing things you don't want to do? Like, it's like so clear to me like that.
How do you balance between doing things you don't want to do and doing things that you serve a thing you want to have happen or do, but you sort of have to like do them to get there?
I've struggled with this my whole life, because I think I've been told my entire life, to do this thing you have to do these 10 things first, or like you have to go through this process to do X, Y, Z. And I found that that's when you really are doing what you want, you almost never run into that problem of like, oh, I have to go through this thing that I really don't want to do. Like, if you're really doing what you want, almost every step of the way feels awesome. Like, there's like good stress and bad stress.
Yeah. And
like, bad stress is just, I don't want to do this and I hate it. Good stress is like, oh, this is going to be so hard, but I can't wait. Like, and I think, I feel like, I was told this a lot when I was a kid, like, you have to get good at doing things you don't like doing. It's like a part of life. And that always felt horrible to me. And I found that, like, that is something that should not exist, really. Like, you should really try to do the things you want to do. And that doesn't mean it's not going to be hard or like really, really painful or like terrifying. It just means you'll know why you're doing them. And that confidence makes it
to actually do that.
Yeah, like,
I hear you. Okay.
If you hate something, like, realize that. Don't do it. Like, yeah, I think it's and also I think things tend to work out in life when you're doing what you want to do. When you're not doing things you really want to do, the magic doesn't happen. Like, there's so many intuitive things you can't control that happen when you're doing what you want, just because you naturally have this effect on your surroundings, just because you're really excited and happy. It's so hard to quantify and very hard to describe, but you know and you see it. I think the thing I emphasize a lot is that it does take sacrifice. Like, you can't do what you want and also have everything else. And like, doing what you want at its best means sacrificing a huge amount of other things.
Yeah. So, life philosophy. Yeah, my life philosophy for a long time has been, if you just work extremely hard, you're almost never going to regret it. And like, you're almost always going to regret not working hard enough at something. You're just going to be like, man, I wish I like worked a little harder at that and did a little better. Like, I wish I was a little more like on it in school, or like, I wish I was like more on it on this project so I didn't get like canceled from it or something. So I was like, okay, if I see something that I actually want to be doing, I'm going to work as hard as possible at that thing so I don't regret it later or lose the opportunity to work on that. And luckily, the thing that I was always most interested in, that always took a lot of hard work, was building stuff. And like, when you actually like build something and complete it, like, that hard work pays off. So then you get this like little momentum boost from it. And then I don't know, there was like this self-referential like feedback thing. I would just like keep working on like these really hard things, and they would keep rewarding me. And it was just like this unbelievably good piece of momentum. And I think like more people should experience that, because you kind of don't experience it unless you work really hard for like at least a week straight at something, and then like actually like feel the result of that. And it's not so much like what the thing is. Like, it could even literally just be like digging a really deep hole, or like doing some manual labor. Like, it's not that
rule. Yeah, totally.
It's not complicated. Or like going to the gym. Like, you get a bit from going to the gym, and then like seeing the results of it, and you're like, oh, this is awesome. I got muscles now. Like, it's pretty awesome. But when you're building something new, there's this other element to it where it's also like, it feels like you're in like uncharted territory a little bit.
Yeah.
But if you get there by just working really hard, you don't feel like you're an outsider.
Yeah.
You feel like you kind of earned it. And
Totally.
There's this other piece where it's like, everybody's an expert because they worked really hard to get there.
Yeah.
And like, oh, if you could just like work really hard, you can become an expert at anything. And it's like, oh, okay, like, maybe I could do anything. And that was like just the most inspiring piece. And it was always like, I'm not really that smart. Like, it takes me a long time to learn stuff. But like once
I would disagree, but
but it's like, I don't know, I'm just able to like work really hard at stuff.
Right.
And stay on it for a long time and not really give up, because it's like, I know that the hard work will reward me. I think that's one of those things that like nobody can take away from you. It doesn't really matter what you're born with. Like, as long as you just like increase the amount of hard work that you're able to do, you're always going to get somewhere better. So it's always worth working on. It's always worth like trying harder at. And it's always worth like figuring out more ways to trick yourself and working really hard. Like I would go on runs and I would like run as far as I could in one direction and just like pretend that I didn't have to run back. Because then you end up running twice as far. And then you're gonna like increase like twice as quickly, and you're gonna get to run like twice as much in a month as you did before. And I always think like if more people operate like this, like imagine how much sooner we could have had semiconductors or something.
Yeah.
If everybody was like building more things and building it so much more quickly, we could have all these technologies like way sooner in the future, because people
Or solve more problems that exist too, like 100%. Yeah. This is sort of my thesis as well. How do we cause this?
Yeah, how do we make it happen? How do we get more people who are like working as quickly as possible and make stuff happen? Because things will happen sooner. And like, what if we had semiconductors in the 1620s? Like, where would we be today? Like, we'd have already had the AI thing. We'd have already figured it out. We'd have already figured out how like whatever the controls are or something, or like we'd be like the servants of their overlord ship. And then and then it would be even faster because the AI is way better at things than we are. But we figured out how to like work with them in synergy. I don't know, something. It's like, but we'd just be moving so much faster through the future. And it's like, I feel like people are either afraid of the future because like, you know, they're worried that it's going to be scary or difficult. I think like that's pretty real. And like maybe the existential threats we're worried about now are the ones that take us out. But maybe if we worked harder, we could figure out a way that they wouldn't take us out. I think like doing lots of hard work is always.
I think it's fear of the unknown, but most of the time the unknown actually isn't a risk. It's like you are either stepping through the door and seeing what's in the door. You can most of the time step back through the door. And also forgetting that like most of the world, like a lot of the world and a lot of the way things are like also sucks already. Like there is still a lot of war. There is still a lot of people that don't have a lot of the things that we take for granted. Like we don't have it perfect yet, anywhere near there. And it's a similar thing too. I think it's just like exactly what you were saying earlier, where it's like a local maximum idea. It's like you can't possibly imagine until you get there what is possible.
I mean, I've been surprised how many times when we're working on this idea, we're just like staring into a void of nothing. Like it's like, oh, like I don't know. Like we ask ourselves a question and it's just like, no idea. Like at the first moment, it's just like we have absolutely no clue.
Yeah.
But that's so exciting. Like, I think something that I've thought about recently is like, there's nothing more exciting than an inviting unknown. Like when it's not just an unknown that's like terrifying, but it's like, it's calling to you. Like the battle cry to like shoot into that unknown is, I think, one of the greatest things ever. And I think one of the coolest things about searching for the global maximums is like every day you can be encountered with that kind of thing where you're just like, I don't know. And then you just start doing it and you're surprised. Like things you don't expect to happen. Things, behaviors reveal themselves you didn't even think existed. That is so cool. And it's inviting because you're excited about it. And it's inviting because you think it's going to be for something useful.
Yeah. And then you invent something new. And then everybody's like, oh yeah, that. And then they just go and use it. And then like the whole world just progresses that much more forward. It's like one of those stepping stone things. Like, yeah.
Well, guys, thanks for doing S3 and doing this interview. And thanks for building Reflect. I can't wait to watch you guys hopefully accomplish the global maximum of that and then see what this unlocks for humanity.
Thank you.
All right, cool, we did it. Cool. Oh yeah.
That was great. That was so awesome.
Much better vibe.
Yeah, felt it a lot better.